My name is Rita Maimbourg. I'm a partner at the law firm of Tucker Ellis, and I'm proud to serve this year as president of the board of directors for the Legal Aid Society of Cleveland. Values of fairness and equity guide Legal Aid's work to ensure justice is for all. In the United States, criminal and civil cases are handled differently by the judicial system. The Miranda rights you hear so often on television crime shows only apply to criminal cases. That means in most cases about housing, debt, education rights, public benefits, or other civil matters that are so important and involve basic human needs, people who cannot afford an attorney are on their own. This is why civil legal aid is so important. Legal aid provides high quality legal representation to people who have low incomes and who face problems impacting basic needs. But besides direct legal representation, legal aid also empowers people with the knowledge and resources to handle certain issues on their own and works towards broad-based solutions to dismantle structural inequities, systemic racism, and other barriers to opportunity. Today, we are happy to host nearly 150 public officials from Legal Aid's entire service area, encompassing the 5 counties of Ashtabula, Cuyahoga, Geauga, Lake, and Lorain. We appreciate you taking the time out of your busy schedule today. We're going to update you on the constituent services Legal Aid provides. Hopefully you will learn about the important and unique role Legal Aid plays in the scheme of social services, hear about Legal Aid's key role in response to helping workers during COVID, and help you get ideas for further partnership via Legal Aid. First, you're going to hear a full update on Legal Aid's work from Colleen Cotter, Legal Aid's Executive Director. Then you will learn from Legal Aid's Economic Justice team about their efforts to help workers facing issues due to COVID. And then you'll enjoy remarks from Senator Sherrod Brown. If you have a question or comment for our presenters, please post them in the chat and we'll curate those and pose them to our presenters as time allows. So now it's my pleasure to turn the proverbial podium, the virtual podium, over to Colleen Cotter, Legal Aid's Executive Director.
Thank you, Rita, and good morning, everyone. It's wonderful to see you virtually. As Rita mentioned, we hope you leave today with a deeper understanding of the important constituent services that Legal Aid provides and our unique role in the social service landscape in Northeast Ohio. We also hope that you are provided with new insights into the issues that workers face due to COVID. And finally, we want to present to you some ideas about how you can stay in touch with our team and reach out to us with constituent needs and partner with Legal Aid in the future. COVID-19's sudden onset, as you know, plunged thousands of Northeast Ohioans into poverty and exacerbated problems for those already struggling to make ends meet. Legal Aid rose to the challenge and continues to serve a growing client community during a time of desperate need. Founded in 1905, our Legal Aid organization is the 5th oldest legal aid in the country and the only one in Northeast Ohio. Today, we operate multiple offices and serve residents of Ashtabula, Cuyahoga, Lake, Lorain, and Geauga counties. We have a staff of 64 attorneys and 44 administrative and support staff. We also have 3,000 volunteers, 600 of whom engage in a case or a clinic each year. Our $13 million budget allows us to help between 15 and 20,000 people through cases annually, and we also provide community legal education and outreach to thousands more. Folks who qualify for legal aid are people at or below 200% of the federal poverty guidelines. That means for an individual, their income is $25,760. For a family of 4, it's $53,000. You can see that these are people who would be unable to purchase the services of an attorney in the free marketplace. We all know that based on the most recent census data, 31% of Clevelanders live in poverty, well below that 200% threshold, including 43% of African American and 40% of Hispanic residents. and almost half of Clevelanders under 18 have experienced poverty. In an average year at Legal Aid, 97% of our clients made less than $25,000 a year, 71% of our clients were women, and about a quarter were older adults. At Legal Aid, our goals are we have 4 basic goals: improve safety and health, promote education and economic stability, create safe and stable housing, and ensure government and justice systems are accountable and accessible. So our first goal, research shows that 80% of an individual's health has nothing to do with health care, but instead has to do with social and economic factors. We address social determinants of health. Unstable housing circumstances result in downward spirals of health. So in addressing issues of safety and health, we secure safety for domestic violence victims and other victims of crime. We ensure access to health care, and we address issues of hazardous conditions in homes and neighborhoods. With regard to promoting education and economic stability, I'm just going to touch a little bit on this because my colleagues are going to talk more in more depth in a few minutes. But what we do is remove barriers to opportunity. We do everything from ensuring access to education by being a partner with Say Yes Cleveland, for example, to ensuring that people have access to the very important safety net programs that keep families together and stable during hard times. We also work with low-wage workers, and again, my colleagues are going to talk about that in just a minute. Legal Aid also creates safe and stable housing. If you were with us last year at this event, which was right before the pandemic, so we were actually all in person at our office in Cleveland, you'll remember we delved deeply into our work around housing and preventing eviction. As you can imagine, that's been a significant increase in our work during the pandemic. We focus on housing because housing is a human right, and housing is the foundation upon which families build their life and go to school and go to work, participate in the community. So we're continuing to do that work. We're actually growing our housing work. As you heard last year, Cleveland was the 4th city in the country to legislate a right to counsel in evictions. And we started implementing that program in July of 2020. And based on our first 6-month evaluation, we found that we prevented 93% of evictions in those first 6 months. So it is indeed proving to be a very effective program. And we're excited to work now with Cuyahoga County to expand representation of tenants and work in all 5 of our counties to expand representation of tenants to keep people in their homes. And then our final goal is about ensuring that government and justice systems are accountable and accessible. This is an important goal because legal aid is often the voice and enables people to use their voice with regard to government agencies and the justice system. As an example, since 2019, we partnered with the Cleveland Food Bank and the Center for Community Solutions and a policy analyst to advocate for improvements in Ohio's SNAP program, formerly known as food stamps. And our advocacy in partnership with the Cuyahoga County has increased efficiencies, reduced waiting periods, and resulted in them hiring additional staff, which were really critical to serve the needs of the community in the pandemic. Through this work, we're protecting and promoting both the rule of law and the principles of democracy. Throughout COVID-19, legal aid has remained open and available to provide critical legal assistance in all of these basic needs. While our physical offices were closed to the public, online intake is open 24/7 and phone intake is available during business hours. Our staff have continued to stay in touch with clients and partners via phone, text, video, and email. We're working on plans now for reopening in-person intake in clinics, but not yet. For now, we remain open, providing services remotely, and we have not missed a beat. I'll just have an aside to say The staff at the Legal Aid Society of Cleveland are truly incredible and incredible assets to our community. And because of them and because of our volunteers, we are very proud of the outcomes that we achieve for our clients. For example, last year, we secured safety in 88% of relevant cases, removed a barrier to education in 94% of cases, prevented eviction in 91%, and we increased assets, income, and reduced debt for our clients by over $6.96 million. That's an amazing return on the investment. So we handle quite a few cases, as I've described. We do a lot of community legal education and outreach, and we do impressive advocacy work. And while doing all of this, we are growing. We've had 3 priorities of our growth. One is to impact more families through partnerships. Legal aid works most effectively when we work with other organizations and leaders in the community to remove barriers. So we're in and near schools to serve families of kids in school to stabilize those families. We have medical legal partnerships in area hospitals so that we work side by side with healthcare providers to address social determinants of health. Our second area of growth is to remove barriers to opportunity, the right to counsel that we talked about, advocating for families of children with special needs to remove barriers, expunging criminal records so people can obtain employment. Our third area for growth is to elevate legal aid as a catalyst for community change. We do this by educating decision makers like housing authorities and utilities about rights of the people that they're intended to serve, creating a lead-safe environment for children, and addressing court fees and fines to remove barriers to justice. This growth has enabled us to bring to life our vision of the ripple effect. By growing legal aid's resources, we're able to extend our reach and extend justice where and when our clients need us to remove barriers to opportunity. This brings greater stability to families when their life or livelihoods are threatened. And then it moves families from poverty to greater engagement in our community. When you're no longer worried about, am I going to have a roof over my head? Do my children have enough to eat tomorrow? You can look up and be part of the world around you, and the world can benefit from what you can bring to them. And all of that fosters a stronger and thriving democracy. This is what legal aid is about. This is what we have been able to do throughout the pandemic, before the pandemic, for the last 115 years, and what we will continue to do going forward. So now we have a deeper dive into our economic justice work. At Legal Aid, we have a long history of honoring the dignity of work. Our representation of workers began with our founding in 1905. Some of our earliest annual reports tell stories of our legal fights for unpaid wages for Irish and Italian immigrants who were vulnerable to workplace abuses. Our economy must serve people. If the dignity of work is to be protected, then the basic rights of workers must be respected. The right to economic initiative, the right to productive work, the right to decent and fair wages, the right to private property, and finally, the right to care for yourself and your family. I'm now pleased to introduce my colleagues, Katherine Hollingsworth, Managing Attorney of Legal Aid's Economic Justice Practice, and Mason Pesek, a staff attorney in the same group. Katherine?
Thanks, Colleen. Let me share my screen. So as Colleen mentioned, I am the managing attorney for the Legal Aid Society of Cleveland's Economic Justice Group. And let me just see if I can get this up. Go ahead, Mason. Oh, you're muted, Mason.
Apologies, everyone. So I'm Mason Pesek. I'm a staff attorney here at the Legal Aid Society, including the Economic Justice Unit, specifically in the work group.
And we wanted to just give you a little bit more information about what our Economic Justice Group has been doing in response to COVID to help low-wage workers in particular. So this is a quick outline of what we'll cover. We have a couple of service delivery models that we put in place in response to COVID, and then wanted to give you a better sense of what kind of direct client representation we're doing and some systemic advocacy and impact work that we've been hard at work on this past year. So when things shut down in March of 2020, it became immediately clear that there was going to be a huge increase in demand for help for particularly low-wage workers who had lost their jobs or facing unemployment, some for the first time ever. And to make matters more challenging, all of the ways in which clients would access us in-person intake, in-person clinics, those were all also put on hold. So we knew we needed to be creative and try to figure out how we could meet the community need while also keeping our clients and our staff and our volunteers safe. So we made a plan to adapt our service delivery models. We were continuing to do representation, but also try to make ourselves more available with the increase in demand. So we created 2 new models. The first one is a worker information line. We launched that in April of 2020, and it's available Monday through Friday during work hours. And the concept was taken from our very successful longstanding tenant information line. And that's a way in which we can answer calls from people in our client community who have questions and provide legal information to those folks without establishing an attorney-client relationship with them. So the idea is we can reach more people, we can give them quick information, answer basic questions. It's staffed by, this worker information line is staffed by attorneys and paralegals in our group. Individuals in the community call and leave a message, and it's returned within the same day. Where we identify that someone really has a legal issue and it's something that legal aid would be in a position to assist with, we can actually just create we can open a case for them within this worker information line and have our intake department follow up with them, so we can seamlessly transition from the worker information line information to providing them with legal services if they're needed and it's something that we handle. So from the launch in April 2020 through March 2021, we completed 305 worker information calls, and about half of those actually ended up resulting in intake being opened, where we assisted with additional legal assistance. Some of the common questions that we answer on the worker information line, most of the calls are about unemployment compensation benefits, like how to apply, why haven't I heard anything, would I be eligible, and how many weeks of unemployment benefits would I are available, those sorts of questions. And also some questions, particularly when things started to reopen in our community and people were starting to go back to work, questions about worker safety, questions about protections put in place through some of the response legislation, COVID response legislation. The next service delivery model we put in place was because we had to shut down our in-person brief advice clinics, which are hugely successful. We meet a lot of need in the community through providing brief advice through clinics, and we engage a lot of volunteers in that way. The brief advice clinics, of course, were not safe during COVID. So we worked very closely with our intake and volunteer lawyer program to launch virtual employment virtual advice clinics. They also launched in April 2020, so we were pretty busy right as things shut down, trying to pivot and expand where we could. They're typically held weekly, although sometimes every other week, depending on demand. And the concept is that we have individuals call our intake line, and particularly where they were calling about employment issues related to COVID, like being unemployed, you know, questions about going back to work when those happened, we would open up a file for them, and they would then be matched with a volunteer attorney. And the volunteer attorney would connect with that client for brief advice by phone or by Zoom. And it really sort of depended on the volunteer, how much time they had and how much they wanted to do. But sometimes it was one call, sometimes it was several calls to sort of work with a client through an issue, but still providing just brief advice. And the brief advice clinics have been very successful. As you can see, we've handled 273 cases by 23 volunteer attorneys through March of 2021. We have some attorneys that have handled just a handful of cases, and we've had some volunteer attorneys who've been have been incredibly generous with their time and have handled dozens of these brief advice clinics. Sort of similar to the issues that come up through the worker information line, a lot of questions about unemployment benefits and requests for help to navigate that system, questions about PPP loans and some of the benefits to employees through the legislation in response to COVID. I'll switch it over to Mason for direct client representation.
Hi, everyone. So economic justice handles a wide variety of cases from consumer issues to home ownership issues and bankruptcy and federal tax disputes, but we're going to be focusing on our work specific to employment issues today. And those issues include wage theft, which costs American workers billions of dollars each year. That includes issues such as failing to pay an employee their last paycheck, taking illegal deductions from their pay, or failing to pay them their overtime rates as well. We also handle vocational certification and licensing issues, such as getting licensing for as a daycare provider, as a home health aide, or in the skilled trades as some examples. We do work around sealing of criminal records and certificates of qualification for employment, which helps individuals with conviction records and arrest records and any issues that present a barrier to their employment in good paying work. We also work on employment discrimination and retaliation issues, which is a new practice area for us. And right now we've been focused on helping clients navigate the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, or EEOC, complaint and charge process, as well as the EEOC mediation process to make sure that their rights are protected and they can file those charges with administrative agency. And then another issue area is unemployment compensation. And not surprisingly, as of March 2020, we've seen a huge surge in requests for unemployment compensation assistance as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. So if we see here, our intakes for unemployment compensation in 2019 is around 100 intakes for the year 2020. That obviously skyrocketed to 569 intakes as COVID-19 really became a huge problem. And I mean, countless Ohioans saw either reduction in hours or lost their jobs completely. And then still now in 2021, as of our first quarter, we have a 207 intakes for unemployment compensation issues. And those include cases that are handled through our unemployment virtual advice clinics and by the economic justice group staff. So including our staff attorneys here. And then for our next slide, in addition to our direct representation, we also have engaged in systemic advocacy. So that includes advocating with the Ohio Department of Jobs and Family Services, or ODJFS, on unemployment system improvements. So the Economic Justice Group and myself in particular, we've been working with legal aid organizations statewide to engage ODJFS in discussions regarding problems we're seeing clients have with the UC system and changes that should be made to improve the application process. So some of those issues include issues with complying with overly burdensome identity verification requirements, as the state has really tried to emphasize fraud reduction. Dense and confusing notices sent to claimants that an individual is going to have a really hard time deciphering without legal assistance or assistance from the department itself. excessive waiting and processing times for claim applications and appeals. And those are just a few of the issues that we've been speaking with ODGFS about and trying to find some solutions for. Then last week as well, I spoke and testified before the Ohio Legislature's Unemployment Compensation Modernization and Improvement Council on behalf of legal aids across the state, sharing client experiences and frustrations with the unemployment compensation system and suggestions for potential improvements on the system. So something that we have seen a lot within our client communities is that the unemployment compensation application process is designed primarily to be completed on a personal computer, whereas the majority of our clients, if they have access to the internet, access the internet through their personal cell phone or smartphone. And the system is not designed for easy access via a mobile phone or a mobile internet browser. So something that we have recommended to the Unemployment Compensation Modernization and Improvement Council are improvements to allow the unemployment compensation system to be more accessible to individuals that are accessing it via a smartphone. And in addition to our systemic advocacy on the unemployment compensation issues, we've done some work on impact litigation. So recently, we've been working on a lot of appeals regarding sealing of criminal records. So we filed 3 separate appeals in the 8th, 9th, and 11th districts on criminal record sealing issues. And in each case, the trial court denied the application to seal criminal records, but failed to follow one of the requirements as required by statute. And from that point, we are now appealing those cases and hoping that by appealing those procedural errors, we'll make sure that we have better procedure going forward for other clients that are trying to see that their records are properly sealed. And then how to contact legal aid about employment-related matters. Again, the worker information line is an amazing resource that we've been able to serve a lot of folks with basic questions on that line and also connect them with additional assistance if necessary. So in Cuyahoga County, we have the number there, then a separate number for our other counties. And then we also have our intake department, where if it's a more complex legal issue where the client may think more legal assistance is necessary, they can then go to online and register online and then be contacted by an intake specialist from there, or start the process via phone at our number below. So that's a brief overview. So I can just leave the time then if anyone has any questions they'd like us to answer.
So we don't see any questions in the chat, but if you have questions as this goes on, put them there and we will curate them. But I'm now going to turn the program over to Vanetta Jamison, who was previously board president of the Legal Aid Society of Cleveland. Vanetta, hopefully you're there. There you are.
Yes, thank you, Rita. Hello, my name is Vanetta Jamison, and I'm a former client of Legal Aid. I also had the pleasure of being on Legal Aid's board of directors for 6 years. Now, during that time, I had the honor to serve as a board president in 2016 and 2017. It is my pleasure to introduce to you today United States Senator Sherrod Brown. He's a lifelong Ohioan. Senator Brown has spent his career fighting for the dignity of work, the idea that hard work should pay off for everyone, no matter who you are, where you live, or what kind of work you do. Senator Brown serves as chairman of the Senate Banking, Housing, and Urban Affairs Committee. He also serves on the Finance Committee, the Agricultural Committee, and the longest serving Ohioan on the Veterans Affairs Committee. Sherrod was born and raised in Mansfield, Ohio. He is married to author and Pulitzer Prize-winning columnist Connie Schultz. They live in Cleveland, Ohio, with their rescue dogs, Franklin and Walter. Thank you, Senator Brown, for all your support of Legal Aid and the clients we serve in Northeast Ohio. We appreciate you being with us today and sharing your reflections and remarks. Ladies and gentlemen, Senator Sherrod Brown. He should be on the screen in just a few moments.
I think
there you are.
There he is.
There you are.
Okay, Senator, we can see you and you're off mute. So I think you're on. Oh, but
ready when you are then.
Okay. Can you hear me?
Perfectly. Yeah, go ahead, Rita, whatever you're doing.
Oh,
here.
no. Vanetta introduced you, and so the floor is now yours.
The introduction's already taken place. Wow.
You didn't hear it. It was wonderful.
It's best that what somebody once said, it's just listen to your introduction, but don't inhale it. So it's probably better I didn't hear it. So anyway, thank you. I don't know who did the introduction. Vanetta, I guess Ms. Jameson did. So thank you, and thanks to President Maimbourg and my longtime friend Colleen Cotter. Thank you, and thank everyone at Legal Aid. I've always loved Legal Aid. I remember the Cleveland Legal Aid dinner that we've talked about forever when we had Sonia Sotomayor and the conversation she had with a young speaker who I believe was 18, a fellow Latina, and the impact I could see even in that brief exchange that the justice had on that young woman's life, and wouldn't have happened without Cleveland Legal Aid. So thank you for that. I think many of you know my daughter Emily, who is a she works for ABLE out of Toledo, but she works out of Columbus and works with immigrants and has stories about heartbreak and success and inspiration that so many of your legal services, legal aid lawyers have every day. So, and Melanie and all of you, just thank you for having me. I'm thrilled to be here. And thanks to the public officials here. I know that that many of you are supportive of legal services, legal aid. You don't work there, you support them in your work lives as elected officials. And thank you for all of that. This year, as we know, has been the hardest of a lot of people's lives. We know it's been particularly challenging to Ohioans you serve. The pandemic in so many ways has been the great revealer and the great accelerator of the problems legal aid and so many of you have known about and been fighting for years: racial and income inequality, the fact that hard work doesn't pay off for far too many people. We did a little roundtable about the dignity of work from my position as chair of the Senate Banking, Housing, and Urban Affairs Committee. And one middle-aged woman from West Virginia, Southern West Virginia, from coal country, said, they call me working poor. Working and poor shouldn't be in the same sentence. And she's so right. A grocery store worker in Southwest Ohio early in the pandemic told me, she said, they call me essential, but I feel expendable. They don't pay me much and they don't protect me at work. Even before this pandemic, we knew that hard work wasn't paying off for so many Ohioans. Corporate profits have gone up, the stock market's gone up, worker productivity has increased, executive compensation's exploded upward, yet wages have essentially been flat for years. I don't blame that only on Donald Trump. It's been long before this last president. It's been a problem that this society has just refused to face. You know how important it is. 40% of Americans reported before the pandemic they couldn't come up with $400 in an emergency. You have certainly heard the figure: 25% of people who rent spend more than half their income in housing, meaning one thing goes wrong in their lives. Their car breaks down, their child gets sick, they miss work with a minor injury for a few days, and they end up on the street. And you've had to deal. That was before the pandemic. We know that a year ago, so many families began having these emergencies all at once. That's where your work came in, where legal aid is so important. Working with many of you in local government, you're working to prevent evictions and utility shutoffs. I know you worked together to pass the right to console ordinance in 2019. That was a lifeline to so many Clevelanders over the past year. I've met with many of you like Councilman Griffin since the start of this pandemic. I spend much of my day on virtual roundtables with community leaders and local officials learning about what you need. That really is essentially how we passed, why and how we passed the CARE Act, why once President Biden took office, we passed the American Recovery Plan by listening to local officials, knowing what you need, listening to legal services, listening to advocates for low-income people. We worked to get as much of that as possible into the rescue plan. We put, it meant shots in arms, money in people's pockets, kids back in school, workers back in jobs. And in that plan, we made sure two of my top priorities were in this plan, and two of your top priorities, emergency assistance for renters and homeowners, and direct flexible aid for local governments. As local leaders, you know your communities best. Too often it seems Senator McConnell and some other people in the Senate wanted, when sending money to local government or bypassing local governments, just sending it to state governments. We knew that you didn't have the flexibility this last round. The dollars, many of the dollars went directly to local governments, and you make the decisions on how best to spend that. We brought almost $800 million to Ohio to help renters pay back pay and utilities. The moratoria in place on electric and water shut off, the moratorium in place on for rent is important, but the dollars needed to come to back it up. You know that these moratoria have been essential, but they're not enough on their own for all the people who are left behind with no way to for them to catch up. We heard that from a legal aid attorney from Ohio who we invited to testify at our very first hearing after I took over as chair of the Senate Banking and Housing Committee. Now, the committee that I now chair, one of the most, I think one of the most important committees in Congress, in the Senate and the House. The committee has been just referred to as Banking Committee or Senate Banking. But for too long, the committee's full name is Banking, Housing, and Urban Affairs. For too long, this committee's been all about Wall Street, very little about housing, essentially nothing about urban affairs. We changed that. One of our first hearings was the state of housing. What do we need to do to fix housing in this country? It's the first time in 9 years this committee has done a hearing on housing. We did the first hearing ever in this committee on climate change. We did the first hearing ever on structural racism in housing, from the black codes to Jim Crow to redlining to the discriminatory practices locked in during the last administration and regulatory bodies. We have an opportunity in this committee on investing in communities like ours that have been left frankly on their own by state government, by a essentially pretty incompetent state government and an uncaring state government in our state, and by a national government that simply hasn't been paying attention. I live, as some of you have heard me tell this, and I apologize for hearing it again. Connie and I live in zip code 44105, south of Slavic Village in the city of Cleveland. That zip code in 2007, in the first half of that year, had more foreclosures than any zip code in the United States. We know communities like ours have been left behind. We know there are homes in Cleveland that could sell for $50,000, $60,000, $70,000, help to repopulate this city and in inner ring suburbs if people could come up with the down payments. Some even would be paying less in a monthly payment than they do now in rent. We know we can get ahead of that and put the word, that's why I call this committee the Senate Housing and Banking, or the Senate Banking and Housing Committee, because it's so important. I encourage all of you, one of the great things about legal aid, and when I've talked to Melanie and Colleen and others at Legal Aid, one of the things that always strikes me is the stories you can tell and the stories you do tell. And you share your stories with each other, with the media, with me, with Senator Portman, with your House members. It can make all the difference in the world. It's how we build momentum for change, whether it's housing, whether it's criminal justice reform, whether it's immigration, whether it's any of the issues, the panoply of issues that you work on so effectively at Legal Aid. I'll close with a brief story. I've begun working with Doug Jones from Alabama. Now I'm building the tradition. Doug lost his reelection in 2020. Go to the Senate floor. I invite 6 senators, 3 Republicans, 3 Democrats, and we divide up that we divide the letter, Dr. King's letter from the Birmingham jail, the 1963 letter, that I assume every legal aid lawyer in the country has read that letter. But I also assume perhaps many of you have not read it more recently than you read it back in law school, or you read it just because you care about civil rights. But I'd suggest you read it again. I've gone back and read it several times recently, but we go to the floor, these 3 Republicans and 3 Democrats that join me, and we divide this letter into 7 parts, and each of us reads the letter in succession on the Senate floor. And I always say for myself, if I could, a section of the letter that includes my favorite Dr. King quote, when Dr. King said, "Progress never rolls in on wheels of inevitability." Progress never rolls in on wheels of inevitability. You know the progress you make one by one with legal aid. You know the progress you make for our community and for this country, because working together, those of you that are part of legal aid, Cleveland Legal Aid, those of you on this call that care about legal aid and support legal services in your work days as volunteers or as elected officials is so important. So thank you for having me today. I'd be glad to take questions if that works in the program.
All right, I am going to try to get back on video. Host is not allowing me. So can you hear me though, Senator Brown?
Hear you.
Okay, so one of our attendees is curious to know your perspective on this White House and their interest in the Legal Services Corporation and funding for legal aid.
I think this White House is, I think, let me say something about Joe Biden. 2 years ago, I think Joe Biden thought when he, this is his 3rd try for president, he had never ever in his career, in his 2 tries, won even one primary. I think when he first thought about running 2 years ago, he thought that, I'm gonna run. If I win, I will work to restore America to a pre-Trump normalcy. I think that's the way he looked at this job. Then the pandemic hit. Then he won the South Carolina primary and essentially just sort of cruised to the nomination. Now I think, and I know Biden pretty well. I mean, I've known him for 25 years. I served with him a little while in the Senate, although not much overlap in 2007 and 8. But I think he looks at this job now as LBJ and FDR. FDR without the segregation of the New Deal, of course. And I think Biden is all about justice, all about social and economic justice. I think he recognizes that we go big, and that's why he's done this rescue plan and the Family Act. I mean, my single, when we passed on March 6th, the recovery bill, the recovery plan, I was leaving the building and a reporter said, what are you thinking? I said, it's the best day of my career, because we had just passed provisions I'd worked on for 8 years on the earned income tax credit and the child tax credit, which will cut poverty literally in half if we expand it beyond 1 year. I mean, we are working to expand it, make it permanent. President saying now 5 years, maybe 7 years, we're working that out. But I know that's a long answer to your question, Rita, but it really is. I just think that Biden want anything that has to do with justice. Some of it is what Congress does specifically, directly to alleviate poverty and to fight for civil rights and voting rights and worker rights and gay rights and human rights. And part of it is funding organizations like yours that make those fights one by one and bigger than one by one on the ground. So I don't know what his budget will be and what his long-term plans will be, but I'm confident that he understands funding legal services it's way, way, way higher on his agenda than it's been for a number of years in our government.
Okay, next I have a question for Colleen. What is legal aid doing to help with the pay to stay ordinances that some communities have passed or are considering passing? If a city is interested in this, how can legal aid help?
Well, thank you, Rita, for that question. And hopefully you can hear me.
Yes, we can.
Yes, great. So legal aid does not engage in lobbying activities, but we do work in partnership with other organizations and with elected officials to analyze situations and help provide information for those elected officials to make their decisions. So a lot of communities are looking at pay to stay legislation, and pay to stay legislation is really quite straightforward. It essentially is legislation that requires that if a tenant is behind on rent and gets served with an eviction, that the landlord has to accept late rent and fees anytime up to the date of the hearing, and then the eviction is dismissed. So essentially, if the tenant makes the landlord whole, the eviction goes away. Right now in the city of Cleveland, and in actually all of our communities in our 5 counties, the tenant could still be evicted even if they have the money to pay and are willing to pay it. So a number of communities are looking at this. We have been working with partners to analyze the impact of it, to explain what happens in communities where this works and where we don't have it. What we found is that in cities that have such legislation, housing is stabilized. And in the long run, that's better for everybody. So if communities are looking at this, please reach out to me. We would be happy to work with you to examine things and examine how the various types of legislation is put together that could work best for your community.
Thank you, Colleen. Now another question for Senator Brown. How has your office invited legal aid attorneys to provide counsel on issues of low-income people? What Ohio topics are important for public officials to engage with legal aid on?
Well, frankly, whatever you come forward with, as I mentioned, Rita, we in our first hearing, first hearing when I became chair of Banking, Housing, Urban Affairs in February, our first hearing, we brought in a legal services lawyer from Ohio to testify. My office reaches out regularly to legal service lawyers around the state. I have my daughter, doesn't exactly lobby me, but talks about legal services a lot and what she's done with ABLE out of Toledo and Dayton. As I said, she works out of her home in Columbus, did before the pandemic too, on these issues. So I just understand always I'm going to be open. I can't think of any, I can really think of no group that reaches into the communities that don't have much voice in government, that reaches in better than legal services does to protect people, to help people, to give people opportunity, but also to be their voice with people like me. So I haven't talked to every one of you all the time, but all of you should feel free to reach out to Aaliyah and John in my office, in Ohio, or Vince or Jeremy or Sarah in Washington, or on the committee to our staff director, Laura, or Alicia, any of us on any of these issues. I would think the one where I can be the most help to you is always going to be housing. I work on immigration issues some, but it's not a specialty of mine. I learn from you, I learn from my daughter about those issues. The work though on housing is really what, it's what I care the most about. I recognize, as you do, that if you live in a neighborhood without access to public transit, without access to good food, nutritious food, a real grocery store, you live in a school where the schools are not as well funded and the opportunity's not as great, it really, really matters. And or you live in an area where I remember some years ago, I've been near West Side. I can't remember exactly where it was, maybe West. I don't want to say, there were foundries that were there closed 40, 50 years ago, and the dirt still in people's front yards that kids would play in had toxic substances in it, toxins in it, metals in it. And we know the problem of lead still. And those issues are one of the things that I will work on, and I'm working on in this committee. So certainly on housing issues, especially reach out.
All right, I have another question for you, Senator Brown. But first of all, was that Walter barking or Franklin?
That was they were both barking at once. They always fly in tandem.
All right, now this is a big one. Are you seeing progress being made in the ability of the Senate to reach compromise on issues to get things done?
Yeah, on issues that there is serious bipartisan interest, but I would answer it more this way, Rita, that it's not up to Mitch McConnell or Rob Portman or Sherrod Brown, politicians talking in the third person, or it's not up to any of us in the Senate to decide what's bipartisan. It's up to voters to decide and the public to decide what they want done. And when we passed the Recovery Act, more than a pretty strong majority of working class Trump voters supported the Recovery Act. But no Republicans voted for it. So I want to be bipartisan, but I want to get things done. I want to get big things done. Rob and I, it's important. I just introduced a bill on Buy America on the infrastructure bill that will really matter for American jobs. I mean, we are working together on that. So far, he has not said he will vote for an infrastructure package. He wants it to be much smaller, but I think we go big. I will continue to try to make things bipartisan, but saying the most important thing is bipartisanship, to me, that should be the secondary thing. The most important thing is to get big things done that will matter to people and will make their lives better. And that's what we did with cutting the poverty rate in half. No Republican voted for that. Doing the child tax credit, on the $40 billion, most of the $40 billion for emergency rental assistance, on the bill that I've worked on for almost a decade to restore pensions to 100,000 union families. No Republican support for that. So, I also hear, and I don't mean to belabor this too much, but 4 years ago, we were going to do a $1.5 trillion infrastructure plan. It was going to be bipartisan. President Trump supported it. The Republicans were running the House and Senate. I was publicly for it. Most of us were in both parties. And then the president and Mitch McConnell took a U-turn or a right angle turn or some kind of turn, and instead took that $1.5 trillion and did a tax cut for the wealthiest people in our country. No Democrats supported it. So I hear them now say, let's be bipartisan, and I want to be, but most importantly, I want to get big things done. And that is my mission and my goal, to fight for this community and fight for this state and fight for justice the way legal aid does, not just be able to do a kumbaya and do a signing ceremony where we do only incremental steps and we call it bipartisan.
And speaking of getting things done, one of our attendees asked this question: can your committee bring changes to the appraisal process, especially since one of the greatest barriers to building wealth by urban homeowners are redlining practices?
Yeah, I saw that question or that comment from my friend Cheryl Stevens, and she's right about that. And that's something we know that there are areas, I assume people in this call know, redlining literally was initially a red line around a community mostly of color where banks simply wouldn't loan. And we know that, that there is a reason that there is such wealth inequality. There is a reason that there is these divisions, and a big part of it was government policy, aided and abetted by the largest banks, or maybe it was bank policy aided and abetted by our government, where we're after World War II, Black men, I mean, it was mostly men, and Black men and women couldn't get the same kind of GI Bill help that whites did. And we saw what happened to home ownership. That's why it's one of the reasons home ownership is so much, the rates of home ownership are so much higher in the white community, people that look like me rather than people that look like Cheryl Stevens. And we know that's a big reason for wealth inequality. So her ideas about appraisal is part of what we are figuring out as we move forward on this too. And that's why we did the hearing. As I said, we did this hearing on structural racism and housing to examine a lot of this. And it's to many of my colleagues, this is kind of news. They weren't really aware of this. And there's a book I would recommend called if you really care about housing discrimination and race and how it's come together and in housing and wealth inequality, a book by a guy named Richard Rothstein called The Color of Law. There's also another book that just came out called The Sum of Us by Heather McGhee. And Heather McGhee testified in our committee last week on our Dignity of Work hearing. And there's a third book called Evicted by Matthew Desmond, where he spent a few months, I'm not sure how long, living in a mostly white trailer park on the edge of Milwaukee, which is a lot like Cleveland, and as you know, and then lived in the inner city, mostly African-American, and wrote about what happened with evictions to people and how their lives were turned upside down. So Cheryl's absolutely onto something here. We are pursuing that, and I appreciate her insight that way.
All right, we have our minutes, so I think this might be the last question. We hear that workers are not going back to work due to unemployment and pandemic unemployment. How can we help companies who are seeking to hire and retain employees?
Yeah, I understand that sentiment. Back when we passed the Recovery Act, which passed, the CARES Act a year ago, 14 months ago, March of 2020, the beginning of the pandemic, there was one amendment offered on the Senate floor by Republicans to the agreed on bill. They had decided there's one thing they cared the most about, and it was to strip away the $600 a week unemployment, additional unemployment benefit that people were going to get. And their argument was people won't work if you provide them with that extra money. And I just, first of all, unemployment, so many people were losing their homes or about to, so many people were being evicted or about to. And we just thought that we defeated the amendment, but fairly close. It was a pretty much partisan vote, not entirely. But it says to me that there are people that are doing okay with their unemployment, but it's illegal to turn down a job so you can continue to, if you're offered a job, so you can continue to draw unemployment. I think partly this is going to, this whole time we're in is going to mean increased wages as companies realize they've got to pay a little more to get people back to work. I mean, there are tens of millions of Americans that don't make a living wage. So the answer to your question, while I didn't answer as directly as you want, is we need to increase the minimum wage. We need to reinstate the overtime rule that President Trump took away for workers working 50 and 60 hours and not getting overtime pay because they're considered management, even though their pay and their positions are not really management in that sense. But I'm willing to work with people on your question where we go with it. But I think employers are saying this is a bigger problem than based on not paying wages high enough to get people back into the workforce as much as what the other part of that is most of the people who've left the workforce are women, and many of them left the workforce because they don't have anybody to do childcare. So they should draw unemployment. They should be getting help. They shouldn't be forced back to work if they have no childcare. I mean, it just shows that this pandemic was the great revealer. It really showed the holes we have on our social safety net so that people can be full participants in the economy and be able to raise their children in the best kind of way.
Well, thank you, Senator Brown, so much. I feel a little bit more hopeful now than I did when we started this conversation. Your energy is infectious. Thank you to all the public officials who attended. And there was a question about the names of the books. So Legal Aid will send out an email to all the attendees with the names of the 3 books and the authors so that everyone will have those. But again, thank you. And I think this ends our program. Thanks again.
Thank you, everybody. Kathy, good to see you again, all of you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Colleen. See ya.
Thank you, Senator.
All right.